Bueller. Ferris Bueller.
If Ferris thinks that he can just coast through this month and still graduate, he is sorely mistaken.
A, you can never go too far. B, if I'm gonna get busted, it is not gonna be by a guy like that.
It was just a quirky comedy about a teenager skipping school.
How could I possibly be expected to handle school on a day like this?
But it sparked the imaginations of audiences of every age.
You could feel lightning in a bottle.
I think I had more fun on that movie than I've ever had in my life.
It really just felt like a huge crowd and a spontaneous thing of joy.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off. More than a film, a joyride.
There is something buried deep within each of us, especially when we're young, which makes us just want to fly. And Ferris could fly.
The story of a guy, his girl, and his best friend on the hunt for the best day ever. Pursued by the high school principal and his sister.
Screw him. What a little ass.
It would become one of the most successful teen comedies of the decade, from perhaps the greatest teen director ever, John Hughes. But what seemed a charmed film about a charmed day would push the limits of everyone involved, and this joyride would run into a few detours along the way.
Everybody was tense. It's not all going to be a casual, friendly little party.
There was a real feeling of kind of volatility.
And before they were done, it almost spun out of control.
John's sitting in the corner, and you could feel anger radiating off of him.
Still, in the end, this modest summer movie would resonate across decades. And the story of one great spring day would endure for over a generation. This is the inside story of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. The year was 1986. Ronald Reagan was president. Michael Jackson was selling Pepsi. Madonna was topping the charts. And as the world coped with the fallout from Chernobyl and Iran-Contra, in the theaters, one young man had a mission all his own: to have the best day ever. Opening on June 13th, a low-key summer movie came out of nowhere and captivated a nation. Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
I think that the fun of this movie is what sort of puts it over the top. There's a universality to the idea of wanting to go out and goof off, sneak away from work, sneak away from school.
I remember the audience just shrieking and laughing and screaming so loud. It just felt very electric.
Ferris, it seems to have really struck a chord with the average American teenage moviegoer.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off was a celebration of life lived to the fullest. Its premise was simple. Some days are so nice, you just have to ditch school and have fun.
How could I possibly be expected to handle school on a day like this?
It popularized a mantra that still resonates today.
Life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
The story of a perfect day. Just a guy, his friends, and a priceless red Ferrari borrowed for a few hours. Ferris Bueller put the car in Carpe Diem. It was an ode to breaking the rules, calling in sick and hanging out with your best friend and your girlfriend, taking in the sights of the big city, perhaps ending with an impromptu performance for a few thousand people. The film sprang from the fertile imagination of a writer-director who reinvented teen movies for a generation. The Shakespeare of the suburbs, the Tolstoy of teen angst, John Hughes.
They called him the Spielberg of youngsters.
Everything he does is gold.
He would take the smallest idea and spin it and spin it and extract endless comedic possibilities out of the smallest thing.
Hughes had directed 3 hit teen comedies in just 2 years.
16 Candles had come out a couple of years earlier in 1984. The Breakfast Club had come out the previous year in 1985. And those 2 movies alone changed everything in terms of teen films.
These are really good movies. They're not just brainless romps, they actually are well observed.
John Hughes came along and changed everything because he remembered, as he once said, that at that age it can feel as good to feel bad as it does to feel good.
He just had that uncanny knack of remembering what it was like to be a kid.
I really just wanted to do something that was show the positive values of not taking yourself quite so seriously, which is one of the great problems of that age, is that you tend to take yourself very, very seriously.
Ferris is a companion piece to 16 Candles. He talked about them as 16 Candles being a teenager's worst day of your life, and Ferris was the best day of your life.
Clearly, he found some truth there because people still say, I just showed it to my kids. They love it.
Just like its hero, Hughes' story broke conventions all around. It's centered on Ferris Bueller, not just a normal teen, but an icon.
Uh-oh. He's sort of a mythical creature.
Ferris is a genie. Ferris is someone who's telling the world it's important to stop and slow down and take a day off. And it's sort of a profound message, but there's also an impishness to it.
Unlike the angst-ridden youth of Hughes' other films, Ferris was full of self-confidence. So confident, he broke one of the classic movie conventions and talked directly to the audience.
It's a little childish and stupid, but then so is high school.
It was an unusual style.
Everything about it was strange, and not strange in a good way to me.
But Ferris was unstoppable, a force of nature, who could at once have the most beautiful, sophisticated girlfriend in school.
Mia Sara brings a gentleness to the role and a kindness and a sort of a decency that comes shining through, and so you end up just loving that character as well.
She was so sweet and so pretty, and you wanted to marry her.
He's gonna marry me.
And also have a best friend on the verge of collapse.
Pardon my French, but Cameron is so tight that if you stuck a lump of coal up his ass, in 2 weeks you'd have a diamond.
Ferris wouldn't be friends with him if he wasn't interesting in some way and different from the normal nerds.
They borrowed a classic Ferrari from Cameron's dad.
At that time, that California GT was worth about $350,000 or $400,000.
It is his love. It is his passion.
It is his fault he didn't lock the garage.
A car that took a beating, starting when the trio set off to see the sights of Chicago. For the director, the movie was a guided tour, a love letter to his favorite city.
The film is, in a way, a Valentine to his adopted hometown.
From the top of Sears Tower to Wrigley Field.
You see all of his Chicago there, from the school to the downtown. It's all there.
And nothing could top the General von Steuben celebration, where Ferris led a sing-along of 10,000 people on a downtown city street in the middle of a real parade.
And that's one of those magical movie moments where you could feel it on the set toward the end, where the camera cranes up and toward the end of Twist and Shout, and everyone streams into the streets and starts dancing and singing. And it was real. Got chills when we did it, and so we knew, okay, this is special.
But as charmed as Ferris seemed, he faced stiff opposition all the way. From his principal.
He's a killjoy and an obsessive compulsive who this particular day is obsessed on seeing to it that Ferris Bueller doesn't get away with his enjoyment of life.
And his disgruntled sister.
Jeannie Bueller always felt like just the person who just couldn't get a break. This is so unfair.
For Ferris, it would be a race to pack in as much fun as possible before he ran out of luck.
Never had one lesson.
Just like its hero, the movie had its share of conflicts and tension as it raced towards its own finish line. For a small film, the studio had a lot riding on it.
Ned was really betting on him and betting a lot of money on him.
For its idiosyncratic director, the filmmaking became a drawn-out process. With too many improvisations, too much footage, too many emotions on the set.
It was always a slippery slope. You get super excited about things and then you get really angry.
It all threatened to spiral out of control by the time the film went into the edit room.
First cut was 2 hours and 45 minutes, which was the longest first cut I had ever done.
And right from the beginning, the filmmakers were scrambling as they rushed to beat an upcoming writer's strike.
If there was a strike and John hadn't turned in a script, then he had nothing to direct.
From the start to finish, Ferris Bueller would be a joyride on the edge, showing just how far you had to go in the hunt for a perfect day. It was the spring of 1985, and Hollywood was running scared. An impending writer's strike meant trouble. With no scripts, no movies could go into production. One studio head was betting big on a new star writer-director and hoping he could deliver in time. 6 years before, producer Ned Tannen met Hughes when he was a magazine writer for National Lampoon.
He was in this room full of guys, and they're all trying to be smart and charming and trying to one-up each other. But the one guy in the room who really got it, who just cut through everything like a laser, was John Hughes. And so Tannen had said to Hughes at the time, if you ever want to get in the movie business, let me know. Flash forward, years later, John Hughes has written the script for 16 Candles, wants to be able to direct it himself.
Ned Tannen made it happen at Universal, where he produced 3 movies that John Hughes wrote and directed.
16 Candles, Breakfast Club, Weird Science, and during that period after Breakfast Club, things began to get a little shaky at the studio. Management changed. Ned was leaving his production deal at Universal and went to Paramount. John was becoming a little bit antsy. His relationship soured with powers that be at the studio.
By that time, John had established his bona fides, and he had done Breakfast Club, and he was a writer, director, producer, so he had the hammer.
When Ned Tannen became head of Paramount Pictures, it was easy for him to lure Hughes over with a big new contract.
Knowing how quickly he could write was going to be a very, very profitable thing for Paramount.
Once he got into place at Paramount, Hughes had to move fast. Upset over home video and health benefits, the writers were getting ready to walk out. A strike was looming, less than a week away.
If there was a strike and John hadn't turned in a script, then he had nothing to direct.
Hughes didn't want to get caught in a new studio with nothing to work on. He immediately began pitching a brand new movie idea.
It was something like the 1st of March, 1985. Ned said, John wants to tell us his next movie. And he pitched us Ferris Bueller. I loved it. Ned loved it. He said yes on the spot. He pitched it on a Thursday morning. We talked about the idea of Ferris becoming a kind of a folk hero. We talked about different ways of marketing it. Even in that very first meeting, he didn't have a title. Ned actually named it in the room. After we'd heard the pitch, Ned said, you know what would be a great title for this would be Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And John said, that's it. And that's what it was from that point on.
Hughes had always been a fast writer, but also could be a procrastinator. He owed director Howie Deutsch changes on another film.
He needed to do a rewrite on Pretty in Pink, and Howie Deutsch kept trying to get him to do it. He wasn't doing it. So one day, Howie said, I'm coming over to your house tonight. We're going to sit down. We're going to go through the script. John said, okay, I'm going to go upstairs and write. This is like 10 at night. I fell asleep on John's couch downstairs. John wrote all night long. Came downstairs in the morning, Howie wakes up and goes, okay, did you do it? He goes, no, but I wrote this, and it's great, and I want you to read this. It was like 40 or 50 pages of Ferris Bueller.
Thursday morning, he handed the script in on the following Monday. It was greenlit on Tuesday, and that was life with John Hughes. If the script had been shot exactly the way it was, it would have been a great movie. He changed it over the course of pre-production. He changed it while he was shooting. He changed it in the editing room. But he wrote perfect scripts. I've never seen anything like it. It was uncanny.
Movies like 16 Candles and The Breakfast Club explore what it's like to be a teenager and to be totally in that moment of being a teenager. What makes Ferris Bueller so different is this is a movie about kids who are almost finished with high school and are sensing in an excited way, but mainly in a nervous way, what their future might be like.
We're gonna graduate in a couple of months, and then he'll go to one school and I'll go to another. Basically, that will be it.
I thought it was very smart. There were allusions in it that I didn't quite get because I wasn't as tuned into popular culture as John was.
Good as the script was, Hughes never stopped tinkering with it as the story grew and grew.
And he would present these long scripts, and they would shoot them, and then he would cut everything down after it had been shot, which is not necessarily the most economical way to proceed.
He didn't really stop writing. All through rehearsal, all through shooting, he was writing. So if you hadn't shot a scene yet, there was nothing for sure that that was going to be shot.
Part of his process was also that he would show up at the set in the morning with new pages he had written.
You went to Daly's the first day and there were scenes that weren't in the script, that people would be frantically going through things saying, what is that? Oh, that character isn't even the script.
With a green light to production, they turned to casting. With a strike looming, they had to move fast. And that was the way Hughes liked it.
It isn't that normal development phase where you have a script and then you do another draft. It was greenlit the minute it came in. So bang, there were casting directors, and bang, there were conversations.
John did everything on these movies, and he knew exactly what he wanted. He didn't procrastinate or say, oh, I want to see more people.
Had a real feel for casting, obviously. Look at the people that he put in his movies. Always drove the casting directors a little crazy because they'd have a schedule.
One of the tricks was trying to schedule, because if he really liked somebody, he could spend 45 minutes with them, and then I have actors backed up like crazy.
What was cool about John, it wasn't necessarily the reading, it was who you are.
Clearly, the key to the movie, the most important role, was Ferris Bueller.
It was a real tricky part because he could have been a real jerk. I think from the beginning that was the trick, was to get somebody that you were just going to go along and believe everything.
You had to love Ferris Bueller enough to follow him and do whatever he said to do.
Come on, love a little. Hughes and the producers considered a cross-section of young stars for the role.
Because John Cryer was making such a huge impression on us in Pretty in Pink, he was definitely discussed to play the part of Ferris.
My first list of actors to talk about, I had Matthew not available. Right at the beginning, it's like, oh dear, he's not available. And so then you start looking where else there is.
We met everyone in town. I remember James Spader coming in, and then he was in Pretty in Pink. Nick Cage came in. I mean, a lot of people came in. Kiefer Sutherland.
I read George Clooney, who was lovely. He was just too mature. He would have been the college student Ferris Bueller. I met Johnny Depp. John Cusack was the only other one that I thought was a real possibility. Yeah. He was my backup.
But ultimately, Ferris would be a star coming off a successful film and a hit Broadway play.
We met a lot of people, and we hadn't met Matthew yet. It was actually sort of later in the process. He'd done War Games. He was on Broadway.
A trained actor who took his craft really seriously.
War Games came out the same month that Brighton Beach opened, so I opened in this enormous hit Broadway show, opened with a bang.
Yeah, he was kind of smoking hot at that time. He was quite a star.
Everything I touched turned to gold, is what I'm trying to tell you.
We flew to New York to meet him. Matthew was nervous about doing it.
I was a little bit hesitant at first because I thought, when you're starting out, you think, I have to do things that are different, and I've just finished talking to the audience twice. I did Brighton Beach and Biloxi Blues where I talked to the audience.
One of the things that he wanted to talk about was all the dialogue to camera. You watch the movie now, it's seamless.
Freshman.
Just like part of who he is. It doesn't feel like you're stepping outside the movie. And the script was written that way, too. But he wanted to make sure he could pull that off. So he spent a lot of time talking to John about that.
I suddenly found myself in a position of trying to choose things. It's very peculiar to go from auditioning for everything, seeing if you get anything, to, okay, what do you think you'd be best at?
In the final scene of the play, the audience is there, and Matthew's sitting here, and I was sitting here, and we're supposed to be soldiers during World War II. He's talking to the audience this one night and telling the story, and he's writing something, and he nudges me, and I'm supposed to be asleep, and I open one eye, and it says, they offered me Ferris Bueller.
With Matthew Broderick in place as Ferris, the casting directors needed to fill the other roles. But the star's first choice to play his best friend couldn't even get an audition. On the next Escaping Evil.
I loved him.
John Hughes had pitched and written the script for Ferris Bueller's Day Off in just 3 days, and studio president Ned Tannen had rushed the film into production to avoid the looming writer's strike. Now with Matthew Broderick, star of the hit film War Games, playing Ferris, the rest of the cast still had to be found. Most importantly, who would take on the role of Ferris's best friend, Cameron?
Alan Ruck was Matthew's idea.
Ruck had auditioned for Hughes before as Bender in Breakfast Club, a role that went to Judd Nelson. He had been a staple on the Chicago stage and had appeared in a few movies before moving to New York to audition for a new Neil Simon play.
I was working with Alan at the time in Biloxi Blues, and I just thought he was a wonderful actor, and when I read it, I just kept seeing him.
My agents said, we tried to get you an audition, but they think you're too old. You know, we told him that he plays opposite Matthew every night on stage. He looks very young. Please see him. So I went in and I saw Janet Hershenson and Jane Jenkins. Read for them, it went very well. And then the callback was with Matthew and John.
He and Matthew had incredible chemistry.
Matthew and I were already friends. We didn't have to make up anything. We already had our own sort of shorthand sense of humor, and I was completely relaxed because it's Matthew. It took a little while to get back to me. I think they were still trying to find someone who had a name.
But even then, it wasn't a slam dunk.
We also tested Eric Stoltz and Raphael Samaj, were our other two finalists.
I know that it was offered to Emilio Estevez before me, and pretty much every time I see him, I want to hug him, because he didn't need it, you know, and I did.
With the best friend cast, it was time to find the third member of Ferris's group.
Do you have a kiss for Daddy?
Are you kidding?
Finding Ferris's girlfriend was a particularly difficult challenge. Hughes wanted to cast against expectations for this role.
He didn't want the kind of all-American girl next door that everybody would identify with.
The Sloan part was fairly open when the tests were done because there was a bunch of really good choices.
Meg Ryan came in and was great. And I remember that everybody said she's great, but she's just so good that it made me not look good enough.
We had Meg Ryan read with Alan Ruck.
They were like, Meg should play Ferris. They wanted more of a partner, less of the Ferris.
Kira Sedgwick was another possibility we liked for Sloan. She read, I think, with Alan and with Eric Stoltz.
John took the chance with Mia, who was a little less tested than the others, but had the right qualities that he was looking for in this character.
Mia Sara read with Alan.
Brooklyn-born Mia Sara's only previous credit was as the female lead opposite Tom Cruise in Ridley Scott's fantasy epic Legend.
As an actress of that age, mostly I was reading for like European-y type movies.
Mia Sara brings a gentleness to the role and a kindness that comes shining through, and so you end up just loving that character as well.
She was the only real teenie in the piece. I think it was very difficult for her because she was so much younger than the rest of them and they were all showbiz. You know, sophisticated, and it was one of her very first roles.
They were all so much more experienced than I was, and so I was really out of my depth.
Mia was sort of mature beyond her years, and we were a couple of idiots. We were basically 12 years old mentally. She was a sophisticated girl at 18.
Crucial to the success of the film was casting the antagonists, Ferris's sister, Jeannie.
We read a lot of people. I think the other one that we were seriously considering was Daphne Zuniga. It looks like that was the final two, but I think Jennifer was also pretty clearly one to beat. It was her confidence, it was her humor. She could be really humorously bitchy, but you still loved her. She had a glint in her eye.
Bite the big one, Junior.
She was a little fearless.
Jennifer Grey's performance is the greatest comedic performance in that film, hands down. She is such a gifted comedian, and we really see it in that role.
Jennifer Grey already had played smaller roles in The Cotton Club and American Flyers, and had appeared with Charlie Sheen in Red Dawn.
I remember going in, not being particularly prepared, not being particularly stoked about it, but I went in, and probably that attitude, which was that kind of like, what? What is this about? What is this whole John Hughes phenomenon?
I can picture her coming in because she came into the room like Jeannie Bueller.
I'm sure that was the essence of Jeannie, just thinking like, what are you all doing? Screw him.
And John got the smile on his face that I always longed to see on his face. And it was just, all right, I think we're doing good here.
And then there was Principal Rooney.
We had all talked about him from Amadeus.
John wanted someone who could pull off that sort of heightened sense of himself that was fun, but not silly.
When Jeffrey came in, it was the buffoonish nature of his and this sort of very straight appearance.
I was shown into this little waiting room, and they said, he's occupied, he'll be in shortly. So I sat there, and I sat there in this empty room. And I thought, no, he's not coming. So I got up and sort of poked my nose out the door, and he said, just sit down. So I went and sat down again. I was waiting for an hour, and then he walked in, and he just sat down. I didn't say hello, and he didn't say hello. And we just sort of stared at each other. And he said, are you going to say anything? And I said, well, I thought you might apologize first.
When actors are waiting, they'll get kind of cranky, but when they came in, they had their full time with John, and John gave them himself, and so they'd leave smiling.
I'm the one who's been waiting. So I think that did it. That was like, because I was annoyed. You know, I had an appointment. I had other things to do, but he was busy. Anyway, he was very funny. We had a really good meeting after that.
His kind of nuttiness was just perfect for what John was looking for with Rooney. That was one of the better roles in the picture.
When I met him first, I said, well, Ed's kind of like Wile E. Coyote, you know, and that was also something that John had in mind, this humorless adult authority figure, and I guess what John had seen in Amadeus was a king who was a little dim and yet likable.
But the real boss at Shermer High is Rooney's secretary.
Grace! Grace is the one who really runs the school. That was my subtext. She takes care of everything and keeps Rooney going in the direction he needs to be going in.
Edie McClurg was a former member of the famous improv group The Groundlings and had numerous roles in television and films.
We had met her before, and she was the funniest woman on the planet. And I just thought her style was going to really fit with John.
I know the Chicago accent, which is kind of a Syracuse accent. My folks were from Wisconsin. I decided that it would be good after dweebies, dickheads, sportos, bloods, jocks. Dickheads? They all adore him. They all adore him. That's how the line ended. I added, they think he's a righteous dude. They think he's a righteous dude. John grinned and looked over at the casting woman, and I had a feeling that maybe I had the part right from then. It's true.
Now all Hughes needed were Ferris's parents. For the father, he turned to experienced TV actor Lyman Ward.
He just had that wonderful, smart but befuddled. He's very bright, he's very loving.
Bit of the absent-minded professor.
But yeah, a little bit of adorable bumbling, I think. Also, I think John liked him right away.
35-year-old Cindy Pickett was younger than what the mother role called for, but she turned in a memorable audition.
Cindy came in. It was so great because she just fumbled everything.
I had the 9 times scene in the phone. 9 times.
9 times.
And there was this shrill, horrible sound on the other end. I learned in the theater, you just keep going. I was completely unfocused. I finally slammed down the phone, and I don't know what I said, but everyone broke up laughing.
And we all looked at each other and went, how could this not be her?
When you look at that cast, what a remarkable cast it is now, and how many of those people were just unknown at that point.
Hughes had chosen his cast carefully, but once he got on location, he began to wonder if he'd made the right choices.
John said, we saw the wardrobe test and it sucks.
I feel pretty, oh so pretty. I feel pretty and witty.
In the summer of 1985, Ferris Bueller's Day Off was moving towards the start of filming. Broadway and film star Matthew Broderick was in place as Ferris, and his friend Alan Ruck playing Ferris's best friend Cameron. Mia Sara, who had only one big film under her belt, had been cast as the beautiful girlfriend Sloane. With veteran character actors filling out the adult roles, the entire team seemed set, but an early meeting gave the actors a scare.
We did a wardrobe test, and John got very concerned afterwards.
It was pretty much us in costume walking up and down Michigan Avenue looking in stores, windows and things. Came into work the next morning, and John sitting in a corner, smoking like a chimney. You could feel anger radiating off of him. I said, what's going on? What's wrong? Michael Chinich said, we think we have a problem. And John said, we saw the wardrobe test and it sucks.
None of us had any spark. None of us were any good.
And Mia starts to sort of shake. He said, there's no chemistry between the three of you. This is the whole movie, it's the three of you guys together, our trio. It's just not happening. We gave Jennifer the day off because when she put the costume on, she was Jeannie, she was the character.
We were all very mad at her for outshining.
Matthew walks in the room, and he's like, he has this habit of like, instead of scratching his ear with this hand, he reaches all the way behind the head. Like this. And he comes in, he's like, hey, how's it going? And he looks around and he goes, apparently not well. They told him exactly what they told us. And he said, wow, I never knew that anybody was supposed to glow in a wardrobe test. Like that. And he completely diffused the situation.
By the afternoon, that was all forgotten.
But echoes of that tense beginning would linger. John Hughes was an emotional whirlwind, funny, passionate, and volatile.
He'd get super excited about things, and then he'd get really angry, or he'd turn on people.
When you work with artists, you understand that he can't just be sensitive while he's writing and then not sensitive the rest of the day. It doesn't work that way.
We terrorized John for a moment there because he thought we didn't care. It was director nerves, I would say, which ended in lots of hugging and a big dinner that night in a nice restaurant.
With the start of principal photography coming soon, Hughes led the cast through rehearsals, focusing in on the core of the movie, character.
He wasn't as technical-minded as some directors, and he wasn't about effects and all that. He was about words. Words and people were his thing.
One of the keys to Ferris was the unusual technique of talking to the audience.
If you had access to a car like this, would you take it back right away?
Hughes had never used it before.
Neither would I.
He told us that Ferris was going to talk to the camera, that he was going to stop things in the middle and turn to the audience.
Never had one lesson.
Which at that point was such an unusual thing to do.
He directly speaks to the viewer. He seems to be aware of them.
4,000 restaurants in the downtown area. I picked the one my father goes to.
We're pinched for sure.
No way, Cameron.
Matthew's a little uncomfortable talking to camera. We were both sort of feeling our way through this technique. I was discovering as we were doing it that once he looked to camera, he had to stay with it. He couldn't look away.
And I'm probably going to have to barf up a lung.
When he looks away, he breaks the illusion. To make it and break it continuously was really distracting.
With a key issue resolved, filming was underway by early September 1985. And Ferris was soon setting off on his perfect day. His first goal, to fool his parents.
They just are so blinded by love for him and by his charm that they can't ever really quite figure out what he's up to.
They aren't naive, they just only see the good.
They may look dim to the audience, but they're forgetting that these are our kids. We want them to be healthy.
Dialogue that didn't end up in the movie. He says, it's almost my duty at this age in life is to put one over on my parents. And God, I hope my kids don't do this to me. And then he pauses. Of course, if they didn't do this to me, there'd be something wrong with them, right? He's very self-aware. That's a teenager's role in life. Doesn't mean he doesn't love his parents, but to push away from them and create his own identity.
Ferris is not just independent, he's street smart. In a scene that was cut, Ferris deceived his parents even more.
There was a lot of stuff in the script about how they were going to get the money to finance this day off. He gets on the phone with his father and manages to manipulate him into telling where he keeps these savings bonds, and he cashes them in.
Ferris's sister is not taken in by his performance.
Jamie Bueller always felt like just the person who just couldn't get a break. I hate him. Just in the shadow of her brilliant, charismatic, charming, funny, adored brother, it was almost like she didn't get enough oxygen.
It was kind of a love-hate. They hated each other, but they really loved each other. And she just couldn't understand why she couldn't get away with what he got away with.
They bought it completely, which drives his sister insane.
That's it. I want out of this family.
In the early weeks of shooting, Hughes spent a lot of time working with his actors, trying to get the exact performances he wanted out of them.
He would always have different faces he would want me to do. He would want me to do really bug your eyes, and then he would do the face like this far from my face, and he would do like... I've never worked that way before or since, nor would I want to. I would still go home at night thinking, oh no, what have I done, what have I done? That is really bad. That was really broad. You're gonna be so screwed when this thing comes out and you look like a freaking idiot. There were some people who really were offended by the monkey see, monkey do.
He'd give me very specific notes like, when your eye comes out, it should open a little bit and then close, and then he'd tell me what expression to make one time. Now I'm just thinking about my face. It makes me self-conscious. So don't tell me to do that with my face again, only I tried to have that conversation. Which I think resulted in, okay, then I won't say anything.
It was the first time that he was dealing with a young person who had something to say, had a position artistically as an actor.
He got mad at me and didn't direct me for maybe a scene or half a scene till I broke. I couldn't take it anymore, and I was like, say something, give me a note. You like it, you know, don't, you said, well, you don't like it when I do. I was like, all right, I do like it when you do. I don't want no notes. Give me notes.
John had worked with very young people. When he was working with them, I think he was telling them, do it exactly like this. And they were like, okay. And they do it. And so I think that that's kind of how he was used to directing. Matthew was 24 years old and had been doing Broadway plays since he was 18. So I just think it was styles. clashing.
Everybody was tense, and he had had huge hits. Here we are with big money movie, and I'm a big shot, he's a big shot, so it's not all gonna be a casual, friendly little party, you know?
We weren't teenagers anymore. We were playing teenagers. So it wasn't that same kind of, like, let's all go hang out together thing that John really enjoyed with the others.
He was really wanting to create like a gang feeling, and, you know, and I think everyone else really could do that, and I just kind of felt out of it.
Hughes and his cast continued to feel each other out. But when the director encouraged his actors to improvise, boundaries began to fray.
I was working 2 jobs, one
Ferris Bueller's Day Off had gotten off to a rocky start. But by mid-September 1985, Hughes had found a rhythm with his actors. Controlling as he might be, he loved to tinker, to rewrite on the fly. And he encouraged his actors to improvise as they went.
And he would sit right underneath the camera and roll through a whole magazine so the actors get into a rhythm, especially actors who are good with dialogue and good with improv.
We would do the script as written, and then he'd say, do something a little different, or give me something, or just surprise me.
Very rarely did he stop for anything. He would just say, okay, and he wouldn't stop the camera. He'd just say, okay, do it again. Let's start from there, or let's pick that up.
Early on, this free-flowing improvisation led to one of the film's most well-loved speeches.
One of the lines that's become one of the famous lines from the movie, life moves pretty fast.
You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
That wasn't in the original script. And it was in rehearsal with Matthew that line came out. Even in the shooting draft, it wasn't the last line of the movie. It was some other line that was, life's a carousel, or something like that. But then on the day, John said, let's call back that line. And of course, everybody remembers that.
Even entire performances could be improvised.
Bueller.
The teacher's roll call was originally intended to be just an off-camera voiceover. But when a friend of the producers, a political speechwriter, walked in, it became much, much more.
Ben had a very unusual voice. And when I started reading this, and the voiceover, Bueller, anyone, you know, the names, I said, wow, Ben's voice would be great for this.
Adams, Adamley, Adamowski, Bueller, Bueller, Bueller. And I started reading that off camera.
The kids in the classroom, every time Ben would say something, they actually started laughing. The crew would laugh.
John Hughes said, let's do that on camera. And then I did it on camera, and the student extras were just laughing their heads off. And John said, why don't you, do you have a scene that you could improvise right now that you could just do off the top of your head?
Ben did his voodoo economics speech, which was a true speech from the Nixon years.
Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
Actually, that to me was a surprise because I thought that was an extremely interesting little lecture, but apparently it's considered a model of boredom.
As the film rolled beyond schoolhouse walls and into Ferris's perfect day, Hughes reached into his own life for inspiration for a pivotal character, which he would develop with the actor.
I found it interesting that John identified as Ferris and not as Cameron. He said he was always the one, he and his girlfriend were doing something, there was always some doofus in the back seat.
They always had some friend of his hanging around who was always envious of their relationship.
Cameron was based in large part on a friend of mine in high school who was sort of a lost person.
What makes that movie more than just a teen comedy is Alan Ruck's performance. Your heart just breaks for him when you realize this horrible relationship he has with his father.
I always felt an openness to trying something besides his way. It wasn't always like it was set in stone.
Several of Ferris's early scenes were improvised as well. In one such scene, Ferris finds ways to make the time go by while waiting for Cameron.
He has a lot of trouble deciding what to wear for the day. I had a karate costume. There was a lot of me wandering around in that outfit. I remember having a 20s style megaphone and just lying on my back on a couch and singing. Because there were some shots, which there still are, of just bored waiting around for Cameron to call him back. But that was cut. And there was besides the clarinet, I think there was a guitar sequence, an air guitar that got cut.
Even as Ferris got ready for his perfect day, others were scheming to stop him. The school principal was seemingly rigid, but his character was developing on the fly.
He so perfectly represents that kind of buffoonish authority figure, that guy who has a little bit of power in the world of this high school and chooses to just blow that power completely out of proportion.
Everything should be in perfect order. Then, of course, at the end of the movie, life's in chaos.
When we started rehearsal, he said, you know, I based this on the vice principal of the school I went to, and we went to his school and filmed there. And he told me that he carried a gun. And then he introduced me to the guy, and he was as serious as a shot in the head. And he actually was packing a pistol, and he was in school. So that gave me an idea, a clue about how deadly serious and humorless the guy was.
He's a man who really has to have that power, who has to sit on a throne. In fact, I gave him a chair that's very low to the ground. I don't know if anybody will notice it. We had the whole desk, the whole thing lowered, so that when he's sitting at his desk, his secretary towers over him.
Edie McClurg played Grace, the principal's secretary. Coming from the world of improv comedy, she had a professional training that Hughes could exploit.
And I was sitting at the desk, and he looked at me and he said, "How many pencils do you think you could hold in that head?" And I put 4 in, and I bent down, and that fell out, and I said 3. He says, "Okay, we're going to start the scene that way." So that's my first thing on camera, is seeing me pull the pencils out of my hair.
Together, Hughes, McClurg, and the cast spun a string of gags into the elaborate telephone sequence.
There's a scene in the office that we improvised.
That whole sequence when Rooney thinks he's on the phone with Ferris, and therefore he begins saying terrible things about Sloane's grandmother.
Yeah, that's right. Just roll her old bones on over here, and I'll dig up your daughter.
That was a much bigger sequence in the movie than had been on the page.
We're all in a panic because I have to come up with some excuse for having mistaken who I think is Mr. Peterson on the phone. We improvised that. Paul, the editor, did a fabulous job of putting it together.
They put Matthew and Alan in the office next door and were able to connect that up so that all of the stuff that happened in the house later matches up to what we did in the office while we were shooting.
They were off camera. On camera, you see Alan being coached by Matthew on the house set, which was done later. But I think that Matthew and Alan did come in, but they weren't saying the script. They were saying things I can't say on your television.
Whatever we did to Jeffrey, I'm sure that was done with John's blessing, and I'm not sorry. I'm not the least bit sorry, and I'd do it again. John just said, you have to put on a dad voice. So we'd been directed by this man, Gene Saks, in New York, in Biloxi Blues. And Matthew actually does a really good imitation of Gene Saks.
A family member dies, and you insult me. What the hell is the matter with you anyway?
Gene is the theater director and very organic and loud and easy to read.
We would screw around on stage, and he would get so pissed off, and he'd scream at us. And so I decided to do an imitation of Matthew imitating Gene, and I didn't tell Matthew I was going to do it, just to get a rise out of it. But it worked. That was my first choice, and it worked. Wound up being in the movie.
In the office, they were just getting started.
We had done everything that was in the script, and then John said, okay, now let's just have some going back and forth between the outer office and the inner office.
He had no problem letting us improvise a little bit within that structure because it was pretty strong.
And Jeffrey is a very script guy. I mean, you know, he was Amadeus, all of that stuff, and Broadway. So he's just used to doing the script. And there wasn't anything there for him to look at. And his eyes got really wide. He said, what are we going to do?
Edie and I had the best fun on this.
There's an actual improv game. I look like I'm helping you, but I'm really hindering you. So I said, in whatever direction I'm going, you go in the opposite direction.
That was entirely her doing. That was great.
All of that flying with the papers and running around him. Whenever he was going one way, I would go the other way. And then he spun around, and we finished. And I thought, well, we're gonna try this again. And John Hughes leaned over to the camera and he said, moving on. One take.
Hughes was on a roll, but with all the improv, the schedule was slipping. And the most ambitious scenes in the film were yet to come.
No, I tell you to damn me.
By October of 1985, principal photography on Ferris Bueller's Day Off had been underway for a month, but already director John Hughes' script rewrites and improvisational shooting style had caused delays.
He never stopped writing, ever, ever, ever. He was always writing. So it began going over schedule.
And the biggest production numbers still had to be filmed. Hughes wanted to show off his favorite city, and he had some big set pieces in mind to do just that. They started in what was then the tallest building in the world.
There was a line when they were on the top of the Sears Tower, when they're leaning against the glass, and Sloane says, "What happens if we fall?" And Ferris says, "Death." And Sloane says, "Cool." And I think the Sears Tower wouldn't let them shoot that.
Then they headed over to another landmark to take in a ball game, Wrigley Field, home of the Cubs.
Never was a Cub fan, never will be. Chicago White Sox weren't playing day games, so I had to shoot at Wrigley Field, which is a very nice ballpark, but wrong team.
From Wrigley, they took a surprise turn for a shot of culture.
It originally said they'd go to the Museum of Science and Industry. And then we went and scouted the Art Institute. And then John just said, oh, if we could shoot here, I want to shoot here.
It was a thrill to be with those paintings for a whole day in an empty room. That was a great pleasure.
This was going to be the most paintings ever in a movie that we were going to see.
It took us a while to get permission to shoot there, and a lot of restrictions on lighting in the paintings. You know, these are classic works of art. The painting that Cameron was looking at was Seurat, and that he was a pointillist painter and painted with the dots. But John saw it, and that wasn't written in the script. He saw that and go, oh, I could say something about Cameron, about how locked he is into his own life.
He kind of identifies with the idea that he's looking at all these little parts of her face and isn't quite sure who he is.
He shot a lot of coverage and he shot a lot of different sizes. There was only so close we could get to the painting because it being a priceless work of art. We had the art department paint like a tiny little square of just dots and shot that.
It's a really powerfully emotional sequence in the middle of a movie that is otherwise very lighthearted and fun.
The highlight of the Day Off, the centerpiece of John Hughes' shoot, was a parade. He'd been thinking about it for years.
When I was in advertising, I was about 2 blocks away from there, and whenever there's a parade, I'd slip out of work and go stand there and watch the parades go by.
This was the most ambitious movie scene that Hughes had ever attempted. He had directed party scenes on a set, but now he was going to have to direct thousands of extras in elaborate musical numbers in the heart of a major city.
We went to the permit office. I said, are there any real parades going on during this? And it turned out there were 3 or 4. And one of them was this giant parade, which was the General von Steuben parade. It was a German-American appreciation.
And it was an actual parade, which we put our float into, unbeknownst to anybody. All the people on the reviewing stand, nobody knew what it was, including, I believe, the governor was there. He didn't know what we were doing.
We built Ferris's float, and then we picked 3 other floats that were real floats out of their parade, and they let us sort of adjust where they were on either side of Ferris's float.
They kept going around behind it with Matthew on the float, and they would keep putting it into the parade.
But at the end of the day, they still had more shots to get, so they planned their own parade and hoped for the best.
They had contests on the radio. They said Paramount Pictures is shooting a film. And we thought, how are we going to have as many people as that real parade? We probably won't. Somebody estimated 10,000 people showed up. So it was way, way more than expected.
Choreographer Kenny Ortega, who would go on to choreograph Dirty Dancing and direct the High School Musical movies, was called in to stage the big number. But his star had a problem.
I was just trying to learn Twist and Shout. And I hurt my knee terribly, right early on shooting that movie, actually. One of the scenes running through a yard, I dislocated at my kneecap and big swollen. So I couldn't really rehearse, and I had to change a lot of choreography. He was like, just make it up. Just mess around, which is basically most of what you see. The girls are doing choreography, and I'm just running around out of not knowing what's happening. But That was encouraged by both John and Kenny. They wanted me to look like I didn't know what I was doing, which was fine and was true.
There was a shot of a construction worker high up on the building dancing. That was a real construction worker. We were filming and the music was blaring. Someone poked John or the cameraman and said, look that guy up there. Tilted the camera up really quickly and caught him. Never knew who he was.
As Crane came up, we realized, oh my God, we've got thousands and thousands of people. They were coming from all over the immediate area and thought it was a real parade, thought it was a real event.
Now, that's one of those magical movie moments where you could feel it on the set toward the end where the camera cranes up and everybody streams into the streets and starts dancing and singing. It was real. And it was just, you got chills when we did it. So we knew, okay, this is special.
It really just felt like a huge crowd and a spontaneous thing of joy.
The parade was the highlight, but there were other stops around town that Hughes was trying to work into the schedule, including Ferris's appearance at a local radio station.
He goes on a radio show and is interviewed.
Saying that I was going to be going on the space shuttle next year. I was going to be the first teenager in space.
The trailer for the film actually went out with some of that material and had to be recalled because the day before the trailer was to play, this terrible thing happened with the shuttle.
The Challenger blew up. That took a very tragic tone.
Paramount had to pull all those prints. Then I had to go and recut, remix the picture.
Several other scenes were also cut, though for less tragic reasons.
As part of their touring day where they take one of those sightseeing boats on the Chicago River.
And another scene in the racier part of town also didn't make the final cut.
They did many more things that are not the kinds of things that your parents would want you to do.
They were supposed to take me to a strip club.
The strippers weren't the only ones up on stage.
There was a whole scene where I did an Elvis impression. I sang Are You Lonesome Tonight?
It was a sort of a fantasy sequence, and I had to go make that kind of thing. I'm thinking, my budget, oh my God. You can't just rent that outfit. Those are big deals that nobody even hears about ever.
With all the excess scenes, it wasn't surprising that Hughes found himself over schedule and over budget.
We went about 8 or 9 days over schedule, and that was true of most of John's movies because he shot a lot.
I know he was under pressure from Paramount to a degree.
Nobody really knew whether these movies were going to work or not. Nobody wanted these movies to be runaway productions.
If you budget for a normal movie in the day, 300,000 feet of film, John would shoot 800,000 feet of film and print 70% of that.
And with this time-consuming directing style, it was no wonder the studio started to get a little nervous.
When the schedule began to creep, Ned got on a plane and he flew to Chicago.
A couple of guys in suits came at lunchtime to talk to John, and after lunch, John was pissed off. Apparently what they told him was, we love the dailies, we love everything you're doing, but you have this many days left to finish the movie. Make any kind of movie you want, but you have this many days.
They were a little worried about it getting out of control.
And as the production neared completion of principal photography, those worries would only increase.
So that sequence was scheduled for 3 days, and it took 6 days.
On the next Escape. Heading into the home stretch, Ferris Bueller's Day Off was 9 days behind schedule. John Hughes and his team had their hands full, packing more fun into an already crowded day. Contributing to schedule delays were mechanical problems with Ferris's ride. The 1961 Ferrari GT Spider, a $350,000 vintage car borrowed from Cameron's father.
We had 3 cars. We had what we called the hero car, which the main cast drove in, and then we had a stunt car for all of the fast driving.
It had better suspension, a bigger engine, and there was the one that went out the window that was just a shell.
The cars we used in the wide shots were obviously reproductions because there were only 100 of these cars. Way too expensive to destroy. So we had a number of replicas made.
They were crap, a real pain in the ass. There was one scene that we did 16 takes of, and it's when we're back at the parking garage in the city, and we come to collect the car, and it would come around, fine, talk, pay the guy, go to get in the car, wouldn't start. They just had really cheesy electrical systems.
Like any mechanical thing in a movie, there's constant things breaking down.
There were big cheers when that thing went screaming out the window into the ravine. People were happy to see it die.
That death was not simple to stage.
The climactic scene where Cameron kicks the car off the jacks. It was a big sequence. It was a sequence that was both a dramatic sequence, a dialogue sequence, and an action sequence, because Cameron had to go through this whole epiphany about who he was.
Hughes knew it was a key scene and wanted it to be perfect.
So that sequence was scheduled for 3 days, and it took 6 days.
He was really just like, you got to remember, this, you know, and he was going over it very carefully numerous times about what a bastard my father is, how long this has been going on.
I think Alan had more to say in that scene in the garage when he beats up his car. But I think just the act of beating the shit out of the car really said a lot, so that he didn't need to say so much.
The car is your dad. Let her rip. The car was faced toward the street, and they had a pulley system.
It's on the set because I wanted to see it. I wanted to see how they did that.
We drilled a little hole through the window, and we ran a cable out through a really complicated towing system down through the ravine.
The cable went down the driveway, around to the corner, and down another street, and actually attached to a real heavy-duty pickup truck.
And we had this huge crane with a pulley, and we pulled it out.
And when they said action, that guy in the tow truck just floored it and just spun that thing like a top and went shh, like that.
But it came out the window, you know, they were cranking pretty hard. You know, I think they had like 4 or 5 cameras on it, you know, cranking. But they overcranked, you know, as it came out through the window. And it was like,
The car went out the window. We were hoping that it would clear the building. What we were afraid of is it would break the glass. The impact would slow the car and it would sort of tilt and fall out. But it really actually shot out of the building and flew over the mark that we were expecting, that we had hoped for. It flew way beyond that, and fortunately hit a fence, which kept it from going off of this property onto another property.
They did one take, and that was it. They had several cameras on it. So the challenge in the editing was to build up to that point. The various shots of the car on the jack, that wheel spinning in the air, Cameron kicking the front of the car and so forth, telling that story and rhythmically, and including his performance, his growing frustration and anger, and that was the challenge.
And there were still other problems.
Then when the thing hit, there was a little problem that they fixed it in post. Then they covered it with branches and leaves and stuff. But it was a fiberglass body, so when it hit the bottom of the ravine, the hood ripped a little bit, which a Ferrari would do because it's, you know, aluminum.
It's getting late to September. We were a little over schedule. And the leaves started to change colors. So we had guys with Hudson sprayers, these little paint cans, spraying the leaves green.
After 6 weeks in Chicago, with the large set pieces complete, it was time to head back to California to finish the shoot. Despite the time pressure, John Hughes was having a great time with the final scenes.
It was like a game. There was a sense of play that very few directors that I've ever met do.
One of those scenes was Jeannie finding Rooney breaking into the Bueller home.
Yeah. I mean, I have a very high kick. I've always been able to kick my leg really high. So I did my own kick for my kicking him in the chin, which is very high up there because he's very tall.
When Jeannie kicks me in the kitchen, they were just going to have the kick, and then bam, somebody was going to fill in for me and fall over on the floor. And I suggested that we do it in cuts. And I'd do it myself, and it would be like a tree falling in the forest, and you'd see the boom, 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 and then the eyes go up into the head and fall out of the frame, and then, you know, another angle falling down, and then boom, another angle. So he could do that. It wasn't what they intended to do. It was a suggestion I made, which they refined.
It was done with him nowhere near my foot, and they undercranked it or overcranked it, whatever they call it, which makes it go faster.
There are 3 sizes on the kicks. I thought, well, I'll just have her kick him 3 times. And then when he fell, he had 3 shots for Rooney falling. One was his butt hitting the ground, the other was his head hitting the ground, and the other was from below his feet, where his feet spread apart. And at the same time, Jeannie is running up the stairs, so I decided to intercut them so that she kicks him, he starts to fall, she runs up the stairs, and his head hits the ground, she runs up the stairs some more, and then his feet come apart. And this was not in the script, but it was in the material.
One of the great last scenes showcased a small role with a little-known actor.
Drugs?
Thank you, no, I'm straight.
I recommended that John hired Charlie Sheen, who I just worked with on Red Dawn. but no one knew him yet.
I remember John saying, "This is who I want to cast," and everybody saying, "Who, Charlie Sheen?" And him saying he's Emilio Estevez's brother. He said, "This kid is going to be a star, just you wait."
I thought he was incredible. It was so simple, so profound, and no one could have done it any better.
Charlie was really into it because it was like, okay, I can come in, you know, the whole look and did his hair and, you know, dark shadow under his eye. I can create something here. And it's a very memorable scene. And he obviously recognized that in reading the script and being offered.
It probably only worked a day or two. It was just one of those fabulous scenes. Come in for a couple days, steal the movie, and, you know, go away.
I worked with Charlie's brother on Breakfast Club, and that was very similar. It felt very much like working with Emilio.
The character's name was Garth Volbeck. He and his family had an entire backstory that ended up on the cutting room floor.
This whole storyline was cut about the part of Charlie Sheen played. That was a running story through the film, but all you saw was him in the police station.
And it's like a whole page of dialogue where he's telling a story about this family and their drama.
His family was the family that Ferris's mom was selling the house to because they were moving to town. So it was sort of organically integrated into the story.
And this is Charlie Sheen's character. His family, the Volbecks, there was a little bit more to do with them. His father owned the tow company.
It is a very different movie than it was on the page.
John would like throw out an idea to me in between takes, always. Like it was always like, try one like this, try one like that, do this, do that. And that's my favorite thing, because I think that when you don't quite know what's gonna happen, you know, make up a name, make up another name or something.
You didn't tell me your name.
Oh, well, it's Jean, but a lot of guys call me Shauna.
Okay, Jean.
I just make up a name and I just say, but you can call me Shauna, or my friends call me Shauna. Adding the Donkashane, you know, from the parade was also an improv, and just like singing it as I went down the stairs, and the idea of singing, because, oh, and then the laughing was totally improvised.
Gray's final scene proved to be her most difficult, mainly because of her growing relationship with Matthew Broderick, a relationship they were trying to keep secret.
At least I thought we were keeping it secret.
How are you going to keep that secret on a film set? Good luck.
I had a lot of energy in that scene because it was my first scene with Matthew. So we had this chemistry and this secret, or so we thought.
Hi. Thank God you're all right. You know, we've been worried sick about you.
I found something really funny. And when I looked at him, he would look at me just kind of like with this hilarious expression. I couldn't look at him. And I was biting on my lip. I had blood in my mouth. I was pinching myself. I was banging on myself. I was apologizing. I was almost in tears. I was so out of control with the laughing because I couldn't, like, lock eyes with him. It was just too much for me. If I look at it now, I kind of can see that I'm, like, just barely holding it together. But I was literally digging sharp objects into my own ass.
After 8 weeks on the set, the filming finally reached its end. Each actor got a special send-off, a pie in the face. But for John Hughes, the real pie in the face would come in the edit room as he struggled to finish the film.
He'd say, just burn the negative. I don't care, just burn it.
J.D. Power.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off wrapped principal photography in the fall of 1985, but the real work was just beginning. The original screenplay was 126 pages, far longer than most comedies. Add in all the extra takes, the extra rewrites, the extra improvisations, and there was a ton of material.
He had shot so much footage.
The script was long to begin with, and then John would add things. He would add dialogue and let scenes go on, and there were gags that went on a long time.
An average comedy runs an hour and a half. This was something else altogether.
First cut was 2 hours and 45 minutes, which was the longest first cut I had ever done.
Something had to change. Big decisions needed to be made in the edit room. But John Hughes didn't enjoy the post-production process. At times, it seemed as if he really didn't want to be in the edit room at all.
He loved the act of invention, the sensation of coming up with new material. Shooting a film and finishing a film, I think, were tedious for him.
He came into the edit excited about a new script he had started. planes, trains, and automobiles.
He was much more interested in his next project than he was in finishing the last one. He had these mercurial changes of mood. When we were mixing Ferris, there were days when he didn't show up, and I would say, John, you have to come to the mix. He'd say, just burn the negative. I don't care, just burn it.
I mean, Paul Hirsch did an amazing job with John of figuring out exactly how to give that movie narrative tension, because it's never dull, and it's the hardest thing in the world to make a movie without a conventional three-act story.
To start, all sorts of characters and scenes hit the cutting room floor, beginning with Ferris's other siblings.
We had some younger kids that were cut out.
Played by Josh Peden and Hannah Cotrona.
Real nice young girl. She was probably about 12, 13, something like that. And then there was a little boy who was probably John when he was 6. You know, because he was this very erudite kid. You look at the refrigerator, you'll see like little kids' drawings and things.
I didn't remember these characters at all. What? Who are these people? And there was a younger brother and sister. I have no memory of shooting them.
The Bueller siblings weren't the only characters to end up on the cutting room floor. Hughes had to lose a discovery he was proud of.
When Rooney's at the house, you know, getting chased by the dog, these flowers get delivered. And there was a whole sequence with Louis Anderson talking to him. In the movie, it's just the end of it. He's just like walking away.
More importantly, Hughes decided to change the tone of the film, and Ferris himself, by cutting out some of his darker, more cynical monologues and shaping him into a sweeter, more upbeat character.
In the original script, Ferris was, you know, he wasn't Judd Nelson from The Breakfast Club, but he was closer to that character. He was angrier. One of the things that really bothered me about the script when I read it was that Ferris Bueller was a smoker. And also there was drinking. And I remember saying, you know, we're trying to build a teenage icon here. If we're doing our jobs right, this is a character that's going to last forever. We really shouldn't take a character like that and have him smoke cigarettes.
He trimmed a lot of the more somber talking to the audience. It became more of a comedy.
I do have a test today. That wasn't bull.
When he shortened it, he started to realize that it was a bit of a screwball comedy, not quite so. He didn't want to directly talk about adolescence so much. There were a lot of serious, thoughtful monologues by Mr. Bueller that were, upon second viewing, not so interesting.
They have this long thing about nuclear war and what are they supposed to do about nuclear war.
That sort of tone, which is still in the movie, there was much more of that.
I was serious when I said I would marry her. I would.
You know, the sort of fear of becoming like your parents or losing hope and youth, and that was more directly spoken about originally.
Then, with a tighter, more focused story and a more charming hero, Hughes and his editor realized that the film still needed some radical surgery.
One of the other things that we did in the editing of the film was to change the sequence of events during the day.
It is often said a movie is made 3 times, once in the script, once when it's being shot, and once in the editing room.
It occurred to me very late in the process that the day should be structured so that the parade sequence, which was the biggest and most energetic and most exciting scene in the day, should come at the very end of the day, which was not the original intent. We tested the picture, and it didn't do as well as we thought. John decided that it was because of the music in the museum sequence. And at the same time, I had come up with this idea of putting the parade sequence at the end. So we made those changes at the same time. And when we previewed it next, the picture did much better. He ascribed it to having changed the music in the museum sequence, and I ascribed it to having put the parade sequence at the end of the day.
One change would influence comedy directors for years to come, a scene playing over the credits.
The scene that's over the credits, Rooney on the bus, that was in the body of the movie, in the script. It was, you know, after he'd been defeated, and he was on the bus while we were intercutting with Ferris getting home and running home and nearly missing his dad. But John decided, no, that's slowing it down because it's not a real threat. Rooney's already taken care of.
John had filmed a little tag to go at the end of the end credits in which Ferris comes out.
It's over.
He looks at the audience, he says, "It's over, go home." And I thought, John, no one's ever going to see this tag at the end of the credits because no one ever stays through the credits. Go. Why don't we take the scene of Rooney on the bus, which we had eliminated, which was a funny scene, and play that during the credits. So people will stay, watch that scene, and then they'll see the tag at the end of the movie.
Gummy bear?
Although some directors dread test screenings, Hughes and his editor embraced the process and used audience reactions to help shape the film.
The great thing about editing comedies is that when you go to a screening, you can tell how well your work is working by the volume and frequency of the laughter.
He had a really good ear and eye for what the audience was telling him. He didn't care so much what the card said.
I remember making one significant change in Ferris after the first preview. The preview went very well, lots of laughs, people loved the character.
So something wasn't working, or a character says something. I remember there was something.
I remember them liking every single thing about the movie except for one thing, which was a line that Mia Sara had at the parade.
And he could feel the audience sort of, and afterwards he caught it. He said, there's something they didn't like about that, and he looked at the cards.
She says something like, it's so much harder for boys because a girl can always cop out and have a baby and find some guy to support her. And Cameron says something like, that sounds depressing, and she says, it is depressing, but it's an option. You know, you don't even have an option. Girls hated that line.
It was meant as an ironic criticism of gender politics, but it went over the heads of the audience, and they thought maybe she was espousing that. And he says, oh, we got to get rid of that line.
The young female scores on Ferris at that first preview were very low. And we realized right away from the cards and the focus group, it all came down to that one line. And we cut the line. It was, I think it's the most dramatic preview change I've ever seen by simply cutting one line. We cut that one line, and I think young female scores went up 40 points.
As Hughes and editor Paul Hirsch put the finishing touches on this unorthodox film, the Paramount marketing department faced the daunting task of selling it. And at the first big screening, not even the cast was sure they had anything worthwhile.
We watched it, and we were pretty much horrified.
I would be at a store, and he would appear out of nowhere.
Thousands of captured images.
It was like out of
Early in 1986, with his teen comedy Ferris Bueller's Day Off beginning to shape up, director John Hughes could turn his attention to his favorite aspect of movie making. It was an aspect he took very seriously: music.
He loved music, had an incredible ear and encyclopedic knowledge of music.
He listened to music all the time, John. He was an absolute fanatic about it.
It was incredibly exciting to watch John play with music. We used to go to his house with great bags full of records, and he would play videos, and we would just try different needle drops against the picture, and we would be there all night. And sometimes you were looking for 3 seconds or 5 seconds, the intro to a scene, just to sort of, but it was brilliant.
He would spend nights just sitting in front of his word processor, writing, listening to music, always trying new things.
The Yellow song over the car that became so famous and used in car commercials and everything.
I think Oh Yeah was one of the songs that he sort of wrote Ferris to, and then we found somewhere to put it in.
John gave me full discretion to use whatever music I wanted, and I chose a number of songs. When he saw the first cut, he said to me, the music is great. I loved your choices. It's fantastic. About a month later, he says, I can't stand the music. We got to get rid of it.
He adored you trying different things under scenes, and he played it really loud. He loved loud music.
The one song Hughes knew he wanted to use from the very beginning was the Beatles' Twist and Shout.
He was a big Beatles fan, and he really, really wanted that, Twist and Shout, which was a nightmare the Beatles had this sort of sneery attitude to licensing their songs. They felt it diluted their mojo, that by giving the music away to movies, it made it less special. There was, I think, a committee at Capitol Records that would meet once a year to grant a couple. And we were just in time to hit that meeting. For me, I had sleepless nights waiting for that decision. There was no fallback position on this one, you know, and thankfully we got it. It cost an awful lot of money.
Paul McCartney had mentioned in an interview that he didn't like the horns on this, and that if they'd wanted horns on it, they bloody well would have put horns on it. And I felt really bad because I had offended a Beatle. It actually charted to put this song back on the charts. It's the first time in years that a Beatles song had been on the Billboard charts.
With better pacing and music in place, the filmmakers were finally ready to begin the process of selling Ferris Bueller. John Hughes had worked in advertising for years. With the launch of his new comedy, he'd have the chance to market his own product.
The idea was to make the marketing cool. That was the idea. The idea was that the film is cool, the marketing should be cool, and I think they pulled that off.
He came from that background of advertising, and everybody sort of ended up deferring to him because no matter what he came up with, it was better than what anybody else could do.
I remember the billboards all over the city of the one sheet of Matthew with his hands behind his head and that great smile.
On first viewing, though, some of the cast didn't believe the marketing. They weren't sure the film was anyone's best day.
I don't think it was the final edit, but it was pretty close. And we watched it, and we were pretty much horrified. Nobody said a thing. And then I think Jeffrey piped up and said, "What do you think?" And nobody, everybody just kind of, you know, trying not to swallow their tongue. And truthfully, from that experience, I was like, I don't know. I don't see it. We were just seeing our parts in it, and just not convinced that any of it was any good, you know. And then here's Matthew, like, popping in and out, talking to the audience and being amusing, but maybe this thing's gonna die.
But that all changed with a real audience.
They had a packed theater sneak preview, and I went to see that, and the audience went bananas over it.
I remember the audience just shrieking and laughing and screaming so loud that it was hard to even hear the next line. It just felt very electric.
The premiere was at Grauman's Chinese, and when they came to the parade scene and Twist and Shout, people started standing up and twisting in the aisles. It was so exciting.
I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. People applauded 3 or 4 times in the movie, or more. I mean, they just were crazy about this film.
My wife and I went to see it, and I remember thinking to myself, this movie, to me, is just a work of genius, but I don't know if anybody else is going to get it.
Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects?
My wife and I went down the street to a little, I can't remember if it was Chinese or Japanese restaurant, and we're sitting there at a table in the window, and person after person came up to the window, even then, the first night, and said, Bueller, Bueller.
Although audiences loved the film, not all the critics agreed.
I also, though, remember it getting a lot of bad reviews. It got very mixed. It got some great and some bad. And I got some bad, too, so I was very freaked out and worried.
I think that critics probably looked at it and said, you know, this is just a goof. I find that critics, as often as they get things right, they also get things wrong. They don't necessarily notice the achievement of a movie for a few years until after it comes out.
But there was something about Ferris Bueller that just transcended reviews.
And it played all summer and ended up at $70 million. And the movie was made for $10.8. So it's a very successful movie.
Ferris Bueller was, in fact, Hughes's most successful film to date, and it would set him on the road to even greater success. But success wasn't enough.
He wasn't really interested in playing the Hollywood game.
We can't change the outcome if we join.
More than 1 in 5 kids in America don't know where their next meal is coming from, but you can help. It starts with a code. Find the red...
When it was released on June 13, 1986, Ferris Bueller's Day Off hit the ground running. The film would end up grossing over $70 million in the U.S. alone, ranking in the top 10 most successful films of the year. The ultimate success of the film, though, wouldn't be measured in dollars, but in impact.
Ferris Bueller is such an incredibly powerful character. You can't resist him. You leave that theater with such a smile on your face.
People connect with it. Kids connect with it.
And it's as relevant now as ever.
I think we still care about Ferris Bueller because it is a perfect combination of wish fulfillment and sort of character study.
I'm just shocked and proud that 25 years later, people say, my kids loved that. I'm certainly very, very proud of Ferris.
The film was so successful that it spawned a short-lived 1990 television show for NBC with Charlie Schlatter playing Ferris and relatively unknown Jennifer Aniston as Jeannie. Like most successful films, there was discussion of a sequel to Ferris Bueller's Day Off, but the star and the director could never come together to make it happen.
There was some talk about it, but John never really seemed absolutely thrilled about it. You could sort of do the same thing again in college or at your boring job or something. Until we really have it, a script or whatever, how could I say yes? And he said, well, I'm not going to write a script if Ferris Bueller's not saying yes. I look back on that and think, of course I should have just said yes. That was just really ridiculous of me.
People will constantly come up to me and say, Bueller, Bueller, just constantly. And this is, what's it now been, 25 years since the movie was made. So the phenomenon is still very much alive.
I just made a movie last summer in Moscow, and everybody knew about Ferris Bueller.
I've done about 40 pictures now, including Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back. But the pictures that I hear about most are, of course, the Star Wars movies, but the second most mentioned picture is Ferris.
My boyfriend went to his 20-year high school reunion a couple years ago, and he was like so cool because he said, guess what? Guess who I'm living with? Ferris Bueller's girlfriend. And he it was great. Everyone in Andover in his year was like, no way, man.
Even as recently as 2011, a screening of Ferris Bueller at Wrigley Field broke a Guinness World Record for the largest sing-along.
Listen, I mean, think of all the comedies you watch that are just cheesy or bad, or the characters are not relatable, or the dialogue is not interesting. I mean, there's so many ways a comedy can go wrong. And for Ferris Bueller to be such a brilliant comedy is really quite an achievement.
If you look at almost any of the sort of teen movies of the 80s that were not written and directed by John Hughes, I think they lack some of the resonance of Hughes's movies.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off solidified Matthew Broderick's star appeal. He was nominated for a Golden Globe for his performance as Ferris. He went on to star in films like Glory, Election, and Godzilla, and was the voice of Simba in Disney's The Lion King. He continues to be a sought-after actor for both stage and screen. Jennifer Grey went on to star in Dirty Dancing, and 23 years later was the winner of Dancing with the Stars Season 11. She continues to appear in film and television. Alan Ruck had a long run on the popular sitcom Spin City and appeared in many feature films and television series. Mia Sara appeared opposite Jean-Claude Van Damme in Time Cop and starred in several television movies and TV shows. But the actress remains best known for the role she played in That Perfect Day.
I'm really grateful because it's been a wonderful thing to be in it, and I completely understand why people love it, as much as they do.
Who could have guessed that this would resonate so much with so many young people?
After writing and producing Some Kind of Wonderful in 1986, John Hughes never returned to the teen films that had made him famous. He went on to blockbuster success with Home Alone and its sequels, before turning to such family films as Flubber, 101 Dalmatians, and Miracle on 34th Street. In the end, he preferred just writing and producing. After 1991's Curly Sue, he never directed another film.
He dropped out of Hollywood, and so many directors love showing up at red carpet events, or love showing up at the Oscars, or love being interviewed for documentaries. He lived a normal life in terms of, you know, he hung out with his family and went to restaurants and bookstores and things like that. It's not like he was a hermit. But in terms of the media, he completely withdrew from all of that.
He wasn't really interested in playing the Hollywood game, which is why he moved back to Chicago and worked out of, you know, his home in Lake Forest. He didn't like being in this town, and found a way to do everything that he wanted the way he wanted to do it, and built his own studio there.
Much to everyone's shock, John Hughes died of a heart attack August 6, 2009, at the age of 59.
It was one of the people at Fox News, and he said, can you go on the air now and talk about John Hughes? And I said, has he gotten a Lifetime Achievement Award? Is that what it's about? And they said, no, he died. And I said, that's impossible. He was a young man. He was quite a bit younger than I was. And he said, no, he just died walking down the street in New York. And I always say I broke into tears. I was just dumbfounded. And I might add, again, I wasn't a particularly close friend of his, but I felt he sort of got it about human nature in many, many ways. And I felt sad at the loss. And I still feel sad at the loss.
He wasn't the kind of person you just hung out with, you know. But I loved his wife and his family, and we had a really great relationship.
For teenagers who had grown up on those movies, I can imagine what a huge loss that must have felt like. It's enormous.
He left Hollywood too soon, and he left this life too soon. I loved him so much, and he just enjoyed the hell out of me, and I always appreciate the people who get me. And he was that guy. I loved him very much.
John Hughes may have dropped out of the media spotlight, but the movies he made live on.
John Hughes movies forever changed how Hollywood makes and markets youth films.
His voice has influenced several generations.
Maybe nowhere more so than with Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Hughes set out to chronicle the perfect day. He ended up creating a movie that's lasted 25 years.
He understands the universal things that make people laugh, and the universal things that make people cry, and the universal things that make it so hard to be a teenager.
I think the reason the movie was so beloved is simply because there's a great message. Life is short. You're always going to have things you have to do, whether it may be going to school that day or going to work that day, but that you really should, when you can, seize the day and try to grasp happiness.
It's silly, it's goofy, but life is short. You got to go for it every minute of every day.
It's 25 years. It's kind of remarkable.
2.5 decades later, The Perfect Day lives on.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.